Perfect, perfect. All righty. So the microbial world itself is composed of the most important primary producers in the ocean. And these producers and these microbes fall within either the domain prokarya, which are organisms that do not have a nucleus or membrane-bound organelles, or the domain eukarya, which is what we have. So our eukaryotic cells versus our prokaryotic cells. So your first part I want you to highlight on your notes is that primary producers. If there's something highlighted on my screen that's not a blank that you have to fill in, go ahead and use that highlight tool and highlight that, or underline tool and underline it. All right, so some of the characteristics of this prokaryotic domain are that these are our smallest organisms. They're our simplest organisms. They do lack a nucleus, so I mentioned that just a second ago, that they do not have a nucleus, or what we refer to as membrane-bound organelles, things like the mitochondria and the endoplasmic reticulum and the chloroplast and stuff like that. So all of those are bound by a membrane on the outside. I think of them more like if you filled up a baggie with water or a water balloon, that has a membrane around it. So something that's composed or kind of held within itself. All right. Prokaryotic organisms do have DNA, but it's in the form of a circle, which is called a plasmid. So this is a review back from biology. You did this when you took bio, whether it was with me or another teacher, but you talked about these bacterial plasmids, and we use those for medical uses. So this is how insulin was produced, or how insulin is produced. So they take the insulin producing gene, they splice open a plasmid, they insert that gene, a bacterial organism starts to reproduce and ends up reproducing this DNA that has the gene for insulin, and then insulin is produced, which is super cool. All right. Some of the characteristics of our bacteria. We have some different types of shapes, and we're going to see this with our microscope lab tomorrow. So these shapes include things like spirals, rods, rings, and they are very, very small. So when we talk about bacteria, we're talking about super small organisms. They have this rigid cell wall with this slimy covering that helps it to basically remain protected and helps it to attach to other different organisms and surfaces. So like I said, your body right now is covered in bacteria. And it's not just because you either haven't showered today or you haven't brushed your teeth just yet, but your body is constantly covered in bacteria. There's bacteria in you and on you at all times. So your skin is covered in a bacterial layer, which helps actually with your immune system. Your gut is lined with bacteria. So if you ever get super sick and you've been like, this is kind of gross, but if you've been like throwing up or you've had diarrhea, your gut is messed up and your gut health has to be replenished with all of this good bacteria that's within it. All right, so just a kind of a little fun fact, and you can do this if you have a pencil and paper. If you draw a little dot on your paper with a pencil, so basically just like taking a pen or a pencil and doing the one dot kind of situation, about 250,000 bacteria would fit on that dot, which is insane. That's how small they are. All right, so bacteria, like I said, they have no nucleus. They are prokaryotic, but they do have a cell wall and they do have a cell membrane, and that allows for transport across the organism. It allows for protection as well. All right, this is where we get kind of cool, and I got a video for you on this one. And I love all of anything macabre, basically. There's a fun word for you. So anything dealing with life and death, more specifically. So the macabre is, I guess, a good way to kind of transition into talking about decay bacteria. And decay bacteria are necessities for life, and necessities for death, I should say. But when something dies, it starts to be broken down by bacteria, and that's what these decay bacteria are. So it's breaking down waste, it's breaking down dead organisms. If we did not have things that did this, our world would be basically covered in dead stuff all the time, and nothing would ever get recycled back into the earth. So these decay bacteria are so important. They're disgusting and they do gross things, but they are so important for the sustaining of life on Earth. So they help with this nutrient recycling. They put nitrogen back into our atmosphere through the process of nitrogen fixation. They also break down tissue and basically turn it into gas. So if you ever see like an organism, this is more specifically, I'm going to show you the video of this, but you ever see dead deer on the side of the road, and every time you drive by it, if they haven't picked it up, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's because it's filling up with methane. So as these decay bacteria are basically coming in and taking over the dead organism, they're starting to kind of break it down into the basics of life. So back down into these primary nutrients that are then recycled within our ecosystems. And so occasionally, like I said, you'll see these deer getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually you'll drive by and that deer is no longer as enlarged as it was. And that's because that gas has been released. However, in terms of marine organisms, gas is released a little bit differently. So we talk about giant things on Earth, one of those being the largest mammals on Earth, which are our whales. So when whales die, they end up usually beaching themselves or they sink down to the bottom of the ocean. All right, so these beached whales that are dead, this one in particular is a humpback whale, but they will start to decay over time and something has to be done with them. So a whale just washed up not too long ago on the beach of New Jersey, and they had to actually bury it after they do the necropsy on that. But sometimes these whales can't be buried because they have so much buildup of gas in them that they have to be taken apart. And this is the video. And it does have slightly disturbing footage, so don't watch it if you are queasy.
A camera captures the moment a sperm whale carcass which washed up in the Faroe Islands explodes. The clip, which was shown on Faroese television, has since gone viral, racking up millions of hits on YouTube alone. The dead whale had been lying on the beach for 2 days after getting stuck in the waters between two islands when marine biologist Bjarni Mikkelsen was sent to cut it open. As he made incisions in the whale's side, the carcass exploded due to a buildup of methane gas from the decomposition, creating a loud sound and releasing a pungent smell. It is reported that a local museum will collect the skeleton and put it on display.
Man, so you guys got to see a whale explode twice today. So how interesting. I mean, honestly, you're not going to get this in your math class or your English class. This is about as good as it gets. So I did want to share that just because when we talk about decay bacteria, I can teach you all day long, you know, what it is, and we can talk about it, but until you see it in action, I mean, little tiny microorganisms that fit on a pencil dot are responsible for that type of gas buildup within a body of an organism, and then causing, of course, the buildup, and then, of course, the release of the gas is what caused that to explode kind of out the side. But these microorganisms are so incredibly interesting because as small as they are, they can cause that type of impact on the environment, on an organism itself, which is crazy if you think about it. All right, so decay bacteria, same type of thing. I'm not really going to go into detail. It does that with food as well. So, you know, everybody has done this. You know, your mom or dad or whoever packs you an apple in your lunch, and no elementary school kid wants to actually crunch down the apple. So then you leave that apple in your backpack or your lunchbox, or you shove it in the back of your desk, and all of a sudden, about a month later, you start smelling something. And it's because that decay bacteria has gotten into that veggie as well. I know that my husband and I are not very good about using all of the vegetables that we buy at the grocery store. And so without a doubt, every month, I'm having to pull a shriveled up little cucumber or bell pepper out of the back of the fridge. And you know, that decay bacteria has gotten in there and it started kind of breaking down the tissues of that particular organism. All right, let's talk about some other types of bacteria, because this stuff is not as gross. It is actually beautiful in action. It is not a great beautiful, but it is beautiful. So the next type of bacteria that we find in the oceans are something called cyanobacteria. And it does ask you on this first line to fill in the word photosynthetic. When you fill that in, I want you to make sure that you know that cyanobacteria is photosynthetic. All right, so this kind of has a bluish pigment. It forms stromatolites, which are massive calcareous mounds. And when I say calcareous, you're going to hear this quite a bit for the rest of the semester, but calcareous is just that calcium carbonate base, so that's CaCO3. All right, so these cyanobacteria, some of them have red pigments, which actually contribute to something called a red tide. And I mentioned this, I want to say back in like unit 4, when we were talking about microorganisms. I kind of briefly introduced them, and I was talking about these red tides. And red tides are basically when all of this cyanobacteria is in a particular region, and it causes a complete turn of the ocean to a red color. All right, so this is what a red tide looks like. In person, it would look like the water was just completely the color of blood. So it is super dark red. This picture is a little bit more kind of a pinky orange color. But red tides are so incredibly interesting because they can also glow. So I'm going to show y'all. Trying to find, oh no, this is the wrong link. Let me find it real fast, because I want y'all to see what this red tide looks like. The link got messed up. All right, here we go. All right, so back in 2011, there was a red tide in San Diego.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically.
All right, so I'm gonna actually turn the sound off because it plays like music with it. But I want y'all to see, look at that. Y'all, that is all because of cyanobacteria. So this bluish pigment that they have actually causes a little bit of bioluminescence as well. So you might have seen pictures or videos of people walking on the beach, and as they walk in the sand, their footprints start to glow. And that's because of this buildup of cyanobacteria in the sand coming in from these red tides. So this is taken completely at night. There is no light shining out onto this water at all. That is all little bioluminescent bacteria. And that's what we're going to be looking at in the video that I mentioned earlier, the bacterial communication video. It talks about bioluminescence and symbiotic relationships with these organisms. So let me try to find, there's another good clip of it. There we go. Look at that. How cool is that? And no, it's not dangerous for people to swim in them. It is dangerous for the ecosystem itself, because this is an algal bloom, and it ends up taking away from the necessary nutrients and gases within our ecosystem. So an overabundance of anything on Earth is bad, but how cool is that to look at? I just think that that's super awesome. All right, so that is what a red tide is. All right, these are those stromatolites. This is not like, I always think they look like mounds of like elephant poo. But these stromatolites, we can find them down in the Bahamas. This is also what is formed as a result of cyanobacteria as well. These are those calcareous mounds. All right, so in our domain archaea, we're going to look at some of our bacteria that are super old and ancient. So some of our extreme bacteria. So the most ancient bacteria falls within the domain archaea, and these live in extreme environments. So it's going to ask you to fill in on that second bullet point the word extreme. So extreme environments, these are things like sulfuric environments, acidic environments, alkaline environments. So anything that's not a normal condition. So super hot, super cold, super acidic, something that has a ton of salt in it. So these haliophiles, yes.
What was on that the last part of the last slide, that long blank?
Oh, it cut out. So thank you for catching that. If y'all look up the bullet point before that, where it says red tides or discolorations of seawater due to excess reproduction of dinoflagellates, this excess reproduction is referred to as an algal bloom. Algal bloom. All right. We find these archaea bacteria near our hydrothermal vents. So remember that the hydrothermal vents, super acidic down there, very, 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 very hot. And these bacteria actually live down by the hydrothermal vents. There are different types of archaea bacteria, these ancient bacteria, that don't live in extreme environments, and these particular archaea would live in the water column. So if we think back to Unit 4, this is part of your check for understanding. All right, so non-extreme archaea that live in the water column would be classified as what type of organisms?
Pelagic.
Very good, pelagic organisms. All right, so utilizing those vocab terms, if something lives at the bottom, it's benthic. If it lives in the water column, it is pelagic. Very good. Thank you, thank you. All right. All right, let's look at a little bit about metabolism, and I filled in all of these notes for you. So if you will just highlight a few different things, I only want you to highlight autotrophic, the word autotrophic, which is the second bullet point word, and then I want you to highlight the word photoautotroph. So these are autotrophic organisms that make their own food from light energy. These are things that go through photosynthesis. And then chemoautotrophs are organisms that make their food from hydrogen sulfide, sulfur, nitrogen, and different types of iron compounds. So highlight the words autotrophic and then photoautotroph and chemoautotroph, because those might show up somewhere. All right, heterotrophs are going through cellular respiration. All organisms on Earth go through cellular respiration. We're going to real quickly do a little bit of a review. But when oxygen is present in an environment, the respiration is called aerobic. When it's not present, the respiration is called anaerobic. You do not need to highlight anything on that. You do not need to highlight anything on this either. So nitrogen fixation, it is carried on by benthic organisms. This is organisms that are converting gas, the gas form of nitrogen, into compounds that can actually be used by our primary producers. All right, so then that takes you to your check for understanding. You should be able to answer this, but what does benthic mean? All right, who thinks they got it? What does benthic mean? Y'all should know this stuff. Bottom of the ocean. Thank you, Kyla. I didn't see it come up. It didn't pop up for me. All right. So an organism that lives at the bottom or a bottom environment of the ocean. Very good. All right. Let's take a look at the last two parts. All right. I'm not going to go through this. This is my big old giant PowerPoint. Oh, I am going to talk about this. All right. In your bacterial communication video today, y'all are going to be learning about an organism, a bacteria called Vibrio fischeri. It's a cousin bacteria to the Vibrio vulnificus. Okay, so the Vibrio vulnificus is actually a bacteria that occurs naturally in some of our warmer coastal waters around areas like the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, stuff like that. So this particular bacteria is found in very high concentrations between April and October when those coastal waters are remaining pretty warm. And this is the bacteria that we find in shellfish. So if you hear about somebody getting sick from eating shellfish, this may be one of the bacteria that plays a role in it. This is a very extreme bacteria. Okay, so when a person eats shellfish raw or undercooked, which is very common for shellfish themselves, my husband loves raw oysters. So it's very common to eat shellfish either undercooked or raw. But these bacteria actually enter the digestive tract and start to multiply rapidly. So bacteria go through that binary fission where they basically just split in half, that asexual reproduction, and they can reproduce so incredibly fast. So in addition to actually ingesting these bacteria, individuals who are higher risk can actually become infected when open cuts or open burns or sores actually come into contact with the seawater containing that particular bacteria. And this is what it looks like. Oh man, look at that. So this is a cut that was actually infected with the bacteria itself. So this person was not one who actually ingested the bacteria. It's somebody who was a higher risk individual, meaning that probably their immune system was compromised or not as strong. And these bacteria got into some type of open wound on them. It can cause welts and boils as well on the skin. So these bacteria are either good or kind of bad for humans. So it's so important that you note where your fish are coming from and where your food is actually coming from, because you want to make sure that everything is safe. And there's so many regulations with the FDA and all of our restaurants and stuff like that, and sourcers of meats and animal product and stuff like that, because they have to make sure that this is not in your food, because nobody wants that. All right, let me real quickly talk about why we're doing this unit. So microorganisms are so important to everyday life, whether you realize it or not. So we have medicines that actually come from microbes. My favorite thing to talk about is actually the cleanup of oil spills. So scientists have figured out that there are bacteria that will actually consume natural oil and will eat it out of an environment. So like when the BP oil spill happened, they released a bunch of microorganisms into the water to try to help clean that up as well, because these bacteria will actually eat the oil, which is awesome. So we do care about them. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, but overall they are important to the circle of life. All right, some characteristics of eukaryotic cells. Now that we've talked all about prokaryotic cells and these bacteria, we're going to real quickly look at eukaryotic cells and what exactly they have to do with anything. All right, so eukaryotic organisms, they do have a nucleus. They do have membrane-bound organelles like chloroplast that we use for photosynthesis. They are a very diverse group. They are like plants, but they lack roots, stems, and leaves. So when we start getting into the second portion of your notes on, we'll be doing that tomorrow on Wednesday. So we will be talking about unicellular algae a little bit more in detail. And that's kind of just the last portion of the notes that I'm going to go through today is unicellular algae, and then a little bit about animal-like protists, so that when we look at them underneath the microscope tomorrow, you know what you're looking at. All right, so some unicellular algae. This is your first bullet point if you will fill this in with the word diatom. So a diatom, and I actually think diatoms are super cool. They are some of my favorite things to look at underneath a microscope because they have cell walls that are made of silica, which is a glass-like substance. And these are called frustules. So I want you to fill in that second blank as well. And the whole point of having these cell walls made of glass, made of silica is to allow light to enter because they have to go through photosynthesis. All right, so these are autotrophic organisms. They are photoautotrophs. There's your big vocab term for the unit. But these photoautotrophs, these diatoms, have these frustules which allow light to enter. They also do have a carotenoid pigment. So when you think of carotenoid, you should think like carrot. It kind of gives them like a golden yellow kind of brown color. Not as orangey as a true carrot, but carrots do have this type of pigment as well. They do reproduce asexually through fission. So that very last blank with the one with the little like 4 diamond shape or whatever, reproduce asexually through fission. All right, so that binary fission is just an organism splitting in half on the middle and then forming 2 genetically identical organisms. All right, so this is a diatom. Look how cute it is. They sometimes look like buttons. The ones that we're going to look at underneath the microscope tomorrow actually look like green glass confetti. So they look like little squares all over the screen, which are super, super cool to look at. They're actually very pretty. And like I said, there's a huge biodiversity of all these different organisms. So I'll show you basic pictures for you to identify them with. But for the most part, there is an extreme biodiversity in all of these different microbes, all these different unicellular organisms. I always think that diatoms look like speakers, like little Bluetooth speakers. All right, another type of unicellular algae that we are going to look at and be able to identify is a dinoflagellate. And I love that word, a dinoflagellate. And a dinoflagellate gets its name because it has 2 flagella. And if you remember back to, let's see, when did you do this? You did this in 7th grade. You also did this in biology. So you talked about flagella on unicellular organisms, and those are basically like a little whip-like tail that helps to direct movement of that organism. So these have 2 flagella. They also have an armored cell wall. And the one that we focus on the most in this course is zooxanthellae. And zooxanthellae are these dinoflagellates that are actually symbiotic with corals. So the coral provides the algae with that protected environment and all of these different things they need to go through photosynthesis and to produce their own glucose. And in return, that zooxanthellae actually supplies the coral with the products of its photosynthesis. So it supplies it with the oxygen that it needs to go through cellular respiration, and it supplies it with the glucose that it needs to go through cellular respiration as well. So the coral uses all of these different components and products of photosynthesis in order to create the things that it needs to sustain its own life. So things like proteins and carbohydrates and calcium carbonate, that CaCO3. Notice that it came up again. All right. Many of these dinoflagellates are bioluminescent, and they can cause red tides as well. So the cyanobacteria and dinoflagellates are actually responsible for the red tides that we saw the video of when they were making the water glow or turn like a red color. All right, the next one that we are going to talk about is a coccolithophorid. I'm going to slip through these real fast. Those are all dinoflagellates, and then I will revisit those in just a second, those pictures. All right, so these coccolithophorid, I can't even say it half the time. Coccolithophorid are these little calcium carbonate buttons, so CaCO3, and basically large concentrations of them actually produce chalk. So when we think about calcium carbonate, you need to think of things that are like a chalky substance. So the most common one would be chalk itself. Things like gums are calcium carbonate as well. All right, they are autotrophic. They produce asexually. And so they are very similar to our other types of unicellular algae in that they only need themselves in order to produce more and sustain the continuation of that particular species. All right. Last little section that we're going to go through today is our animal-like protists, because we're going to look at a few of these underneath the microscope tomorrow. All right, so our foraminifera are animal-like protists. And when I say animal-like versus plant-like, and we just talked about a whole bunch of unicellular algae or plant-like protists. Now we're talking about animal-like protists, meaning that they are heterotrophic organisms. They have to hunt for food. So they cannot produce their own food. They've got to actually hunt in order to go through the process of cellular respiration and sustain life. So they have to find some other type of source of carbohydrate in order to do that. All right, they do have calcium carbonate shells. Notice once again, there it is, calcium carbonate. They also have long, thin pseudopods. And pseudopods are another type of locomotion structure. They also help with feeding as well. So pseudopods, a pseudopod basically just means false foot. And when we talk about foraminifera, if you want to write this off to the side, amoebas. Amoebas are an example of a foraminifera, and that's the one that we're going to look at underneath the microscope tomorrow. They are little pink splat marks all across the microscope slide, and they're super cool because you can see all of their pseudopods actually reaching out from the amoeba itself. So foraminifera have pseudopods, long extensions of their cytoplasm. Actually, I'm going to show you all this clip, mainly because your second video is super short. But I want to show you what an amoeba in action looks like eating a paramecium. So paramecium is something that is referred to as a ciliate, and we'll talk about that next. Okay, click. I don't want to, oh man. My screen is frozen and it won't let me click. There we go. All right. Here's an amoeba. An amoeba that is currently consuming 2 paramecium. Let me start that over because I think we missed like a portion of that. All right, so this structure right here is the actual amoeba itself. These are pseudopods, the extensions of that cytoplasm. And these little guys are parameciums, which are ciliates. They have little cilia all around them that helps them to move. But notice this amoeba basically just completely engulfed these 2 parameciums. And there they go. They're freaking out a little bit. So that amoeba will use its digestive juices to eventually break down those parameciums as a food source. So you see them, they kind of become like a blobby mixture. So they've lost shape. This amoeba is a hunter. So these are microorganisms that are heterotrophic, these animal-like protists. All righty. I'm telling y'all, these little things are super cool. You didn't even know the microbial world was this neat. All righty. These are another type of foraminifera, so you can kind of see the little extensions of the cytoplasm coming out from them. These are little these remind me of those Totino's pizza rolls, don't they? They look just like them. All right, last little animal-like protist that we are going to talk about. Actually, I take that back. There are 2 more, sorry. So second to last are radiolarians, and radiolarians create these super elaborate shells made of that silica as well, and they have these radiating spines that come out from them. So radiolarians look like little spiky balls, basically. They live in open water. They are another type of animal-like protist. So radiolarians. These are what they look like. How beautiful, oops, how beautiful are those? So very much so like a snowflake. They have different types of structures. The biodiversity on radiolarians is phenomenal. All right, this is the last type of animal-like protist. So animal-like protist number 3 is a ciliate, and we just saw those. So ciliates have hair-like cilia that they actually use for locomotion and for feeding. And ciliates live in seaweed, they live in gills and intestines of aquatic organisms. And the ones that we always look at in this class are parameciums. So you just saw in the video the amoeba actually eating the paramecium, or the 2 parameciums, I should say. But they have these little cilia. Basically, they look like little furry logs because they have all these little hair-like structures all around them. And that helps them to move and helps them to bring food into their mouth structure. So ciliates, example of them would be a paramecium. Paramecium. Alrighty. I am going to save the second part for tomorrow. I'm going to save invasive species. Actually, you know what? We got 2 minutes. I'll do it and be super fast. Super fast. Oh, there's our example of a ciliate. Parameciums. Look how cute they are. Little furry logs. You can see all the little hairs all around the edges. They've got eye spots on them. They also have an oral structure as well to help them teeth. Look at them, little furry logs. All right. Oops. Let me real quickly go through the invasive species slide. This is the last little section of notes. Just get these written down for that. And I always include this just because a lot of these bacteria and microbes tend to be invasive species. Okay, so a species is considered to be invasive within an ecosystem when it is not a native species. So it's not one that has lived there for thousands of years, hundreds of years. So one that's actually introduced to the environment, usually by human activities. So these alien species, these invasive species, usually cause economic and environmental harm, or they end up posing a threat to human health. So we can have all different types of invasive species. Y'all see one all the time when you're driving through Charlotte, and that's the big kudzu vines that grow on the sides of like 485 and 85. Kudzu is an invasive species. Basically overtakes a complete ecosystem. There are certain types of clams that are invasive species that ruin river ecosystems as well. Alrighty. If you take a look at your notes underneath this slide, there are check for understanding questions, okay? There are also pictures that you have to label. Don't go down to the part 2 multicellular on the next page, but the check for understanding questions you are responsible for answering. If you finish with the other activity today, then I want you to go back in and complete these.